I'm Kate Ambrose, 47, and I'm a colonel in the United States Army. I came up an infantry first sergeant's daughter and built a career guarding some of this country's most protected secrets. Work I was never allowed to describe to the people who raised me. For 25 years, I flew home for every wedding and every funeral, planned every birthday, and showed up for a family that introduced me as the daughter who does paperwork. But when a young captain laughed me away from a door my own signature protected, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been written off by someone you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the spring of 1986, and I was 7 years old, sitting on a porch step at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, waiting for my father to come home from the field. I had been waiting for 3 hours because the buses always came in late, and because I had a drawing to show him, a crayon picture of a helicopter I had worked on all week. When he finally walked up the street in his faded fatigues, smelling like diesel and cut grass, he passed me on the steps, rubbed the top of my head without looking down, and went straight inside to see the T-ball trophy my little brother Doug had won the day before. I sat on the porch with my drawing until the streetlights came on. My father loved us both. He just narrated only one of us. His name is Gene Ambrose, and he gave the United States Army 26 years of his life. He enlisted in 1969, carried a rifle, and then a clipboard, and then an entire company on his back, and retired in 1995 as a first sergeant. If you have ever known a first sergeant, you know the species. He could tell you the serial number of a rifle he carried 40 years ago, but not the name of my 4th grade teacher. He believed the infantry was the Army, and everything else was decoration. He used to say the Army gave him everything, and he gave it his knees and half his hearing, and called it a fair trade. My mother, Rosemary, was the quiet engine of that house. She packed it up and moved it 11 times in 20 years without ever once being thanked in public. I think I learned more about service from watching her than from any ceremony my father ever stood in. She saw me. She always saw me. She just learned early that in our house, being seen by her was a consolation prize. And we both knew whose attention actually counted. When Dad retired in 1995, we settled in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a town that runs on the Army the way other towns run on rivers. I was 16. I stood at the back of his retirement ceremony and watched grown men line up to shake his hand, some of them with tears standing in their eyes, telling my mother what this man had done for them when they were 19 and stupid and far from home. I remember thinking that I wanted a life that mattered like that. Not the applause, the line of people, the proof that you had been load-bearing in lives that never made the news. Doug was 13 then, and already the heir. He had Dad's jaw and Dad's walk, and at the dinner table Dad would run him through map symbols and patrol formations the way other fathers ran flashcards. I would answer the questions first sometimes, just to show I could. Dad would nod, a little surprised every time, the way you nod at a dog that has learned to open a door. It never occurred to him to wonder what else I might learn to open. In 1997, I came home from school with an Army ROTC scholarship letter, full ride, and put it on the kitchen table next to the salt. My mother read it twice and squeezed my hand under the table so hard it hurt. My father was proud for exactly one sentence. He said, "That's my girl." And then he spent the rest of dinner explaining which branches I would not be allowed into: combat arms, the real Army, his Army, and wondering aloud where they would put me instead. Personnel, maybe. Finance. Somewhere climate-controlled, he said. Where the war can't get your nails dirty. He wasn't being cruel. That's what I want you to understand about my father. He was being honest about the size of the world as he understood it, and in his world, there was one kind of soldier, and his daughter was not built to be it. I commissioned in 2001, 22 years old, a brand new second lieutenant of military intelligence. At the dinner afterward, in a steakhouse outside campus, with both grandmothers present, my father stood up, raised his glass, and gave the toast that would follow me for 25 years. To my daughter, he said, who joined the Army to do paperwork in a windowless room. The table laughed. The waiter laughed. I laughed too, because I was 22 and I still thought the price of admission to my own family was being a good sport. I learned that night that some rooms you defend will never be rooms your family can see. I just didn't know yet how literal that was going to become. And here's the part I need you to sit with, because everything that happened later grows out of it. For the next 2 decades, I gave that family everything a daughter can give from a distance. I flew home for every wedding and funeral and christening my orders allowed. I planned my mother's birthdays from 3 time zones away, ordered the cake from a hotel business center in Qatar, once walked a florist in Fayetteville through an arrangement over a satellite phone with a 30-second delay. I remembered every anniversary. I sent money when Doug's first marriage collapsed and never mentioned it again. Not once, not even when he toasted his second wedding without looking at me. I was the one who showed up, the one who remembered, the one who organized, and I asked for nothing back except the one thing they couldn't seem to give me, which was the benefit of the doubt. Doug enlisted in 2001, same year I commissioned and went infantry, of course. He did his tours honorably, Iraq twice, and left the Army in 2009 as a sergeant to become a police officer back home. He earned every bit of respect he got. I want to be clear about that because this story is not about my brother being a fraud. He was a good soldier. The problem was never what they believed about Doug. The problem was that loving him gave them permission to stop wondering about me. At the VFW, my father had a son who cleared houses in Ramadi and a daughter who, as far as he could tell, answered emails. One of those stories was tellable. So he told it and told it and told it, and the family photo that sat on the mantle all those years says everything I am about to tell you. Dad's hand on Doug's shoulder, both of them grinning, my mother's arm around them, and me, half a step outside the frame, smiling like a guest. The distance did not happen all at once. It happened the way erosion happens, one season at a time while everyone is looking somewhere else. In 2009, I deployed to Afghanistan as a captain. I cannot tell you what I did there. I could not tell them either. And that sentence, the one I just said, became the foundation everything else was built on. What I can tell you is that the work was signals and analysis, that it lived behind a vault door, and that in the spring of 2010, a rocket attack took friends of mine whose names I still cannot say in the same sentence as the place they died. That spring, Doug got married. I missed the wedding. I was 31 years old, standing in a plywood corridor 7,000 miles away, listening to my brother's reception through a phone someone held up to the speeches. I heard my father's voice, big and warm, telling the room not to worry about the empty seat, that Kate couldn't be bothered to leave her desk. Laughter. The truth was a casualty list I wasn't allowed to carry into that banquet hall, so I let them have the joke. You can survive being a punchline for an evening. What I didn't understand yet is what it costs to be one for 20 years. By 2014, the pattern had a shape. I was on my second deployment when my parents' 40th anniversary dinner happened without me. I called from a satellite phone, paid for the call with sleep I didn't have, and Doug picked up at the restaurant. He sounded happy. He said something I have never forgotten, not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. He said, "You know, Dad stopped telling people you're in the Army. He just says you work for the government." It went through me like cold water. Somewhere along the way, my own father had quietly demoted me out of the uniform I wore every day, because the version of me he could explain was easier to live with than the version he couldn't. There is a version of this story where I fight back, where I sit my father down at some point in those years and make him hear me. People ask me later why I never did. I want to give you the real answer, because it is the part of this story that lives closest to the bone. It was not fear, and it was not weakness. It was arithmetic. To make my father understand even the outline of my work, I would have had to put things on that kitchen table that do not belong on kitchen tables, and I had signed my name year after year to documents promising I never would. The deal I made with my country was that I would be misunderstood. Nobody puts that sentence in the recruiting commercials, but it is the truest one I know. Every person in my line of work makes that deal, and most of us make it without noticing. And then we spend decades paying installments on it at family dinners. I want to be fair to them, even now. What were they supposed to think? Year after year, I came home with no stories. Doug had stories. The men at the VFW had stories. I had silences with edges on them, vacations I canceled without explanation, a phone I sometimes had to walk out of the room to answer, and a habit of looking at the floor when the news mentioned certain parts of the world. Where there is no information, people do not wait. They write the story themselves with whatever they have lying around. My family had my father's worldview lying around, so the story they wrote was that I pushed paper and thought I was better than them and had chosen a building in Virginia over the people who raised me. Thanksgiving of 2018 put a frame around it. I had just pinned Lieutenant Colonel. There was no party for that because the assignment that came with it was the kind you don't celebrate in public. I drove down to Fayetteville in civilian clothes, which by then was habit and policy both, and at dinner one of the neighbors, a kind man who fixes furnaces, asked me what I did. I opened my mouth. My father answered for me. "She does paperwork," he said, friendly as a handshake. Doug here cleared houses in Ramadi, and the table turned like a tide to my brother, who told the story they already knew and loved, and I sat there watching the torch pass in real time. Doug caught my eye for half a second. I think even then, some part of him knew the math didn't work. He was a cop. He noticed things. He just hadn't decided yet that it was his job to notice this. The promotions kept coming, and each one made the silence heavier instead of lighter. In 2024, I made colonel, 23 years in, and took over a directorate I will describe to you the only way I'm allowed to. There is a category of program inside the Department of Defense that is protected above almost everything else. The people who are allowed to know about each one are counted, named, and signed for, one at a time. Somebody has to be the signature. Somebody has to be the person who decides, this officer enters, this contractor does not. This access ends today. For the programs in my portfolio, after 2 decades of fieldwork and vault doors and quiet rooms, that signature became mine. There was no public ceremony. My family was not cleared to attend the assumption of duties, and the sentence I had to say out loud on the phone, "You can't come. It's a closed event," landed at home exactly the way you'd expect. My mother mailed me a card. My father did not call. The night I took over, my deputy and oldest friend, Lieutenant Colonel Simone Carver, who I had known since the captain's career course in 2006, bought a bottle of gas station champagne and toasted me in a parking lot under a sodium light. "Congratulations," she said, "on the biggest job nobody will ever clap for." We laughed until we didn't. That Christmas, the last one before everything changed, I stood in my parents' living room and listened to my nephew, Doug's youngest, ask his dad what Aunt Kate actually does. Doug didn't even look up from the game. "Nobody knows, buddy," he said. "Probably emails." The room laughed, warm and easy, no malice in it anywhere, and that was the worst part. There was no villain in that living room. There was just a family that had told a lazy story about me for so long it had hardened into furniture. I laughed too, picked up my keys, and drove back north that night instead of staying through the weekend. The porch light got small in my mirror. My own silence rode in the passenger seat the whole way home, and somewhere around Richmond I realized I had stopped expecting them to ever know me at all. I thought that was peace. It wasn't. It was just a quieter kind of giving up, and it held right up until a Tuesday morning in March of 2026, outside a steel door, when the whole arrangement met a 29-year-old captain with a roster and an audience. That March, the program I direct held its quarterly review at a joint base I won't name, in a building you have walked past in 100 movies without knowing what it was. A review like that pulls senior people from across the country into one conference room behind one very specific kind of door. If you have never seen a SCIF, the letters stand for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, but the letters undersell it. It is a vault built to hold conversations instead of money. A room where the walls are instruments and the door is the whole point. You do not get waved into a room like that. You are listed, badged, signed for, and watched, and the list itself exists because an office like mine generated it. I had flown in the night before. Commercial, middle seat. I travel in civilian clothes, plain blazer, plain slacks, a habit so old it might as well be skin. Low profile is not vanity in my line of work. It is policy and it is courtesy. And after 25 years, it is also just who I am in an airport. I arrived early because I always arrive early. The corridor outside the SCIF was government standard, waxed floor, fluorescent light, a line of cleared personnel forming up for badge-in, most of them in uniform. Working the door was a young captain with a tablet, sharp-creased, squared away, the kind of officer who irons his certainty in with his shirt. His name tape said Stanton. Captain Joel Stanton, 29 years old, in charge of access control for the review, holding the roster the way a man holds something he believes is the whole truth of the world. Behind him in the line, I noticed a staff sergeant looking at me a beat too long, the way you look at someone you half remember. His name was Larkin, and weeks later I would learn exactly why he was looking. but that comes. I stepped up to the desk and gave my name, Ambrose, and waited while Stanton scrolled. He scrolled once. He scrolled again. Then he looked up at me, this woman in a blazer with no badge and no uniform and no place in his list, and I watched him reach the only conclusion his roster offered. "Not cleared, lady." He said it flat, and then, because the line behind me was watching, and an audience does something to certain young men, the corner of his mouth went up and he gave it a little air. "Waiting room's down the hall," he said. "Coffee's free." A couple of quiet chuckles moved down the line, the polite kind, the kind people give a man with a tablet because he might check their names next. I had been dismissed by better men in worse hallways. I just hadn't expected the army to sound so much like my father. I did not move. I want to be honest with you about why, because it was not strategy. Some part of me, the part that had flown home for 20 years of dinners to be introduced as the family's email writer, was simply done volunteering for the waiting room. I stood there, calm, hands folded, and I said, "Check the program designator, Captain, not the visitor roster." He blinked at me, the way you blink at a vending machine that has started giving advice. He did not check. He was opening his mouth, and I will never know exactly what the next line would have been, because that was the moment the vault door unsealed from the inside. The watch officer that morning was Major Russell Teague, 38, a man I knew from 2 program cycles and 100 pieces of correspondence, stepping out to start the badge in. He had a clipboard in one hand and the morning on his face. And then he saw me, and I watched the color leave him the way water leaves a sink. He looked at me. He looked at Captain Stanton holding that tablet. And Major Teague said 3 words, evenly, quietly, the way a judge reads a number. "She cleared you." Stanton half smiled because for one more second he thought it was a joke he hadn't caught up to. Then Teague took the tablet out of his hands, no force, just authority, tapped twice, and turned the screen around. It was Stanton's own program read-in record, the document that authorized the captain himself to stand at that door and hold that roster, and at the bottom of it, in the signature block he had apparently never once read, were the words, "Ambrose, Catherine R., Colonel, Military Intelligence, Approval Authority." The hallway went very quiet. Captain Stanton stood in the fluorescent light, holding the paperwork of his own clearance, signed by the woman he had just laughed toward the free coffee, and he froze, completely, the tablet in his 2 hands like something that might detonate. Teague stepped past him, took him by the shoulder as he went, firm, not rough, and moved him out of the doorway, a correction with no words in it, which any soldier will tell you is the loudest kind. Then he held the door. Inside, past the threshold I was finally allowed to cross, Major General Harlan Reese was already on his feet at the head of the table, and his voice came out into the corridor, warm as a porch in summer. "Colonel Ambrose," he said, "we don't start without you." Somewhere behind me the line had come to attention, quietly, awfully, all at once, and Staff Sergeant Larkin's face finished the long arithmetic of where he knew me from. I learned later that his phone carried the story to Fayetteville before the week was out, garbled and growing, the way stories travel between men who served together. Here's what I did not do. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask for his name, his commander, or his career. I did not look back at the line, and I did not stop to watch the young man's face do whatever it was doing behind me, though I am told by people who were there that it was worth watching. I thanked Major Teague. I nodded to the corridor. And I walked into the room my signature helped protect, because the truth doesn't need me to perform it. It only needs a door to open. The vault swung shut behind me with that long, pneumatic sigh they all have. And Captain Joel Stanton was left alone in the hallway with his roster and his free coffee and the waiting room sign hanging over his shoulder like a caption. And for the first time in 25 years, the silence in the hallway belonged to somebody else. The review itself ran 2 days, and I will tell you about it the only way I can, which is around the edges. Imagine a conference table where every seat costs a background investigation. Imagine decisions that will never have a press release, made by people who will never be thanked, about capabilities that exist precisely because nobody talks about them. At one point on the first afternoon during a break, Major General Reese refilled his coffee next to mine and said, in passing, the way other people comment on weather, "Half this building exists because you said yes to it. The other half because you said no." Then he went back to his seat. That is the entire shape of my career in 2 sentences, and my family has never heard either of them. I sat through those 2 days doing the work I have done for half my life, weighing requests, pressure testing justifications, asking the questions that exist to be asked before something irreversible happens, and every so often I caught myself looking at the door. The same kind of door I had been laughed away from 48 hours earlier. There is a strange double vision that comes over you in a moment like that. On one side of the steel, I was the quiet center of the room, the signature every decision routed through. On the other side, I was a woman in a blazer who could be filed under nobody by a tablet and a smirk. Both of those people were real. Both of them had my face. The question I carried out of that building was not about Captain Stanton at all. It was about how long I had been letting everyone in my life choose which one of those women they were talking to, and never once correcting the file. On the second morning, Captain Stanton requested 2 minutes of my time. I confess I expected a performance. Young officers in trouble usually bring one, all chin and rehearsed contrition, eyes fixed on a point just above your head. He did not bring one. He stood in front of me in a borrowed office with his cover under his arm and said, "Ma'am, I disrespected you in front of the line I'm responsible for." I assumed, instead of verifying, I'll accept whatever comes. And then he stopped talking, which impressed me more than anything he had said. No excuses about the roster. No careful little sentence about how anyone could have made the mistake. I looked at this kid, 29 years old, squared away to the molecule, certain of everything until 48 hours ago, and I recognized the species because I was raised by it. The Army builds a particular kind of man, and then it waits to see whether life will sand the certainty into judgment or just into harder certainty. Which way he went, it occurred to me, was partly in my hands now. I told him I would think about what came next and that until I decided he should report to Major Teague. He said yes, ma'am, like a door closing squarely, and left. I sat in that borrowed office for a while after he was gone, and the thing I kept seeing was not the corridor. It was a steakhouse in 2001 and a man standing up with a glass in his hand. The story beat me home. Staff Sergeant Larkin, it turned out, had served 2 tours with my brother and had been at a barbecue in Fayetteville, years ago, where we were both introduced and both forgot it. By the time his version of the corridor made it through the phones to Doug, it had grown the way those stories grow. In Larkin's telling, I had shut down an entire facility, a general had held the door for me personally, and the captain had been led away, possibly in handcuffs. Doug called me on a Sunday, fishing, and you could hear the cop in him, the careful way he laid out what he'd heard, watching for what I'd deny. "Larkin says a 2-star waited on you," he said. "That true, or did he get into the gas station sushi again?" And I gave him what I have always given him, which is nothing, delivered politely. I can't talk about work, Doug. You know that. And here's the strange thing, the hinge the whole year turned on. That silence, the exact same silence I had been handing my family for 25 years, landed differently this time, because for once it had a witness. For once, somebody who wasn't me had seen the shape of the thing I couldn't describe. I could hear it in my brother's breathing, the recalculation. He didn't push. He said, the way he says it in interview rooms. And then he asked about my knee, and we talked about nothing. And when he hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. That night I called Simone Carver from the hotel, because some reflections you cannot do alone in a room with a minibar. I told her about the corridor, all of it, the laugh, the coffee line, the 3 words, the general on his feet. She listened the way she has listened since 2006. And then I told her the true thing, the thing I had been circling for 2 days. It wasn't Stanton's laugh that got me, I said. I've eaten 100 Stantons for breakfast. It was how familiar it felt. Standing at a door I had every right to walk through, being told by a confident man with incomplete information that I belonged in the waiting room. I've been standing at that door my whole life. Simone was quiet for a second, and then she said the sentence that reorganized my year. "You've let your own family run an access roster on you since you were 22, she said. "And you're on it as nobody." I looked out the hotel window at the parking lot and the half moon over the commissary, and I understood, with the particular clarity you only get in anonymous rooms, that I had a signature that opened the most protected spaces in the American government, and no signature at all at my parents' dinner table. One of those was finally going to have to change, and it was not going to be the first one. Before I went to sleep, I wrote 2 notes on hotel stationery, side by side, because I think better on paper that can be burned. The first note was about Captain Stanton, and it was short. A path, not a punishment. The second note was about my family, and it was shorter. A boundary, not a war. I turned off the lamp and slept like a woman who has finally decided something, which, if you have ever been one, you know is a different sleep entirely. The Army moved first because the Army always moves first. Within a week, there was a disposition meeting about the incident at the door, and I want to explain what that means, because it is where the decision I'd written on hotel paper became real. An incident involving a senior officer and a SCIF gets a file, and a file wants an outcome, and the administrative machinery of a base, left to itself, will produce the simplest one available, which in this case was Captain Joel Stanton's career, folded neatly into a drawer. The colonel who ran the meeting had the paperwork already drafted, a letter of reprimand with Stanton's name typed in, and a space for his signature that everyone at the table assumed would be a formality. They walked me through it like a menu, career ending, effectively, for an officer that junior. The room expected me to want it. That is the part that stayed with me afterward, how natural everyone found the idea that the woman from the corridor would want the kid burned down to the waterline as if the only two settings available were invisible and vengeful. As the senior officer involved, I had the deciding voice, and I used it for the only sentence anyone remembers from that meeting. "You don't fix a gatekeeper by teaching him doors are dangerous," I said. "You fix him by teaching him what's behind them." So instead of the drawer, Stanton got a remediation plan with my name on it and teeth in it. Protocol recertification from the ground up. 60 days shadowing the visit control desk of my own program office, the place where access lists are actually built, under the supervision of Major Russell Teague, who had said 3 words in a corridor and would now get the chance to say considerably more. Then I made the second call, the one that had waited 25 years. Sunday afternoon, my parents' kitchen on the other end. I could hear the television and my mother's dishes. I told my father I loved him. I told him the corridor story existed and that I couldn't tell it. And then I told him, evenly, no speech, that I was done sitting through introductions where my life's work was the joke, and that until the joke retired, I would be loving them from my own house. He did what I knew he would do. "It was a joke, Katie," he said. "Family's joke." And I said the sentence I had practiced in the car, "Then this is me laughing from my own house for a while." And I hung up gently, which in my family is louder than slamming. The guilt offensive arrived on schedule. My mother called Tuesday, soft and torn, deployed as she has been deployed her whole marriage, and it took everything I had to hold the line with her, because she was the only one who had never earned the boundary. I told her this wasn't about her casserole or her Christmas, and that I would call her every Sunday, and I have. Doug called Thursday blunter. "You're really going to no-show Easter over Dad being Dad," he said, and I said, "I'm going to no-show Easter because I keep being the only one who shows up as myself and leaves as a punchline." There was a pause, cop length, and he said, "Yeah, okay," in the voice of a man filing something. He didn't argue after that, and looking back, I think that phone call was the first interview of his investigation. And I was the witness who finally said something that didn't fit the official story. An aunt's group text bloomed and died, 4 days of cousins I hear from twice a year explaining my obligations to me in screenshots, and I let every message sit unanswered until the thread starved. A voicemail from my father sat in my phone, unlistened, blinking like a buoy in dark water. I did not back down, and I will not pretend it felt like victory. The first month, peace mostly tastes like missing people you're right about. Easter Sunday, I made my mother's casserole from memory for one, and ate it standing up at my own counter, and if you have ever held a boundary against people you love, you know it was the loneliest correct thing I have ever done. Stanton, meanwhile, was discovering what was behind the doors. He came to the visit control desk expecting humiliation, 60 days of being the corridor story everywhere he walked, and what he got instead was standards. Teague ran him hard and exactly fair, the way the good ones do. And somewhere in his first weeks, the kid watched me do the thing that reorganized him the way Simone's sentence had reorganized me. A general officer, a name you might know, had a pet project that wanted access to material in my portfolio, and the justification did not hold, and I signed the denial. No drama, no meeting, 1 signature, and a 2 stars project stopped moving. Stanton was standing at the desk when it processed. I'm told he stared at the routing slip for a while. The quiet woman from the corridor, the one his roster had filed under nobody, could halt stars with a pen and had been able to that whole morning at the door, and had chosen instead to walk past him and say nothing. Power that doesn't need an audience was not a thing his army had shown him yet. It hadn't really been a thing my family's army showed them either. What happened in Fayetteville that spring, I got in pieces later from Doug and my mother, and I am going to tell it to you the way I finally understood it. The house without me did not collapse. Houses don't. It just stopped working in 100 small ways at once, and nobody could name why. My mother's birthday in April landed flat because the dinner reservation and the cousin's phone tree and the cake from the good bakery had always, invisibly, been me. Doug stood in his kitchen that night, his wife told me later, staring at a store cake with too few candles, and said she wasn't quiet because she didn't care. She was quiet because she was busy doing all of it. The calendar of that family had run on my logistics for 2 decades, the way buildings run on wiring, noticed only at the moment of outage. And Doug, being Doug, went looking. It is the single most touching thing my brother has ever done for me, and he did it like a detective, because that is the only language he prays in. My mother says he started carrying a little spiral notebook that month, the same kind he uses on shift, and that when she asked him what the case was, he said, "Cold one. 25 years cold." He pulled the family photographs out of the hall closet one Sunday and went through them like evidence boxes, and he found what I could have told him he would find, which is that I am in the back row of all of them, half-turned, half-cropped, the family's own filing system confessing itself one frame at a time. He bought Larkin a beer and got the corridor story straight, the actual version, the 3 words, the signature block, the general who would not start the meeting without me. He went home and typed Special Access Program into a search bar and read every public sentence the Department of Defense has ever released about the category, which fits on roughly 1 page, and ran headlong into the wall I had been living behind since 2001. He called a public affairs office. He called a retired warrant officer he knew. Every door said the same thing, politely. And my brother, who had spent 20 years assuming my silence was emptiness, finally understood that the wall was the point, that the absence of stories was itself the story, and that he had been mocking a locked vault for not being a window. My father took longer because the story he had to dismantle was older, and his hands had built it. The crack came at the VFW on a Friday night in late April, and I heard about it from 3 different people inside a week, because Fayetteville is a small town wearing a city's clothes. Dad was at the bar, holding court, and reached for the old reliable, my daughter, the paperwork colonel, and a master sergeant down the bar, a man who had done a tour supporting an intelligence task force in Afghanistan, did not laugh. The room noticed. "First sergeant," the man said, respectful and dead level. The people in those windowless rooms were why my convoy turned left, instead of right, twice. And then he picked up his beer and let the silence do the rest. My father, 75 years old, sat there, while the joke he had told for 25 years died in his hands in front of the only audience whose opinion he ever cared about. He did not call me that night. That is not who he is. But my mother says he came home early and quiet and went out to the garage where he keeps his workbench and his shadow box and stayed there a long time. And the next morning, my commissioning photo, the one from 2001 that had lived in a drawer, was standing on the bench in a frame he had cleaned with his thumb. I asked my mother once, on one of our Sundays, what he actually did out there in the garage all those nights that spring. She said he mostly sat. Sometimes he took the shadow box down off the wall, the one with his own ribbons and his first sergeant's diamond, and held it on his knees like a man reading a letter. Once she found a legal pad on the bench with 3 different openings of something written and crossed out. "Dear Kate. Kate. Katie, I've been thinking." All 3 abandoned. 75 years old, a man who had counseled 1,000 soldiers through the worst nights of their lives, and he could not get past the salutation of 1 page to his own daughter. I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken when she told me, and I have since decided the honest answer is both, permanently, and that loving a proud man means keeping both lit like signal fires and waiting. Stanton finished the middle stretch of his remediation about then, and I got the report from Teague in the weekly roll-up. The kid had caught a real discrepancy, an expired investigation on a visiting contractor's badge that the automated check had missed and a tired desk would have waved through. The old Stanton would have waved it through too, certainty being the enemy of verification. This one stopped the line, ran it down, and was right. Teague forwarded the catch to me without commentary, which from Teague is a standing ovation. I signed the commendation note myself, by hand, no ceremony, and sent it down. I'm told he keeps it. What he said to Teague, and Teague told me months later, was, "She could have ended me, and instead she made me good at this. I have been paid in a lot of currencies in 25 years. That one I kept, and me, I watched all of it from the distance I had chosen, and I want to be honest about how that felt, because this is the part nobody warns you about. It worked. The boundary worked. The house was learning to see me precisely because I had stopped standing in the doorway, explaining myself. And it still hurt, every Sunday, hanging up the phone with my mother and hearing the television in the background of a room I had exiled myself from on principle. I had spent my whole life managing the weather in other people's houses. It turns out houses learn to feel the weather on their own, but you have to actually leave and stay left and trust the climate to do its work. The hardest discipline of my career was not the vault doors. It was sitting in my own kitchen that spring, letting my family find out who I was at the speed of truth instead of the speed of my own need to be known. Doug came to me first, the way I should have known he would. First weekend of May, no warning, I opened my front door on a Saturday morning and there was my brother on the step with a six-pack in one hand and his ball cap literally in the other, holding it against his chest like a man at a graveside. "I came to apologize," he said. "For every Thanksgiving I let him hand me your seat." I stood there for a second, with my hand on the doorframe, 47 years old, and felt 7. Then I let him in, because that is what the door was for, all along. We sat on my porch most of that day and had the conversation that was 20 years overdue. It started clumsy, the way real ones do. He asked if I remembered the porch at Fort Campbell, the one with the loose board Dad never fixed, and I said I remembered waiting on it, and he went quiet for a minute because he understood exactly which afternoon I meant. He had been inside with the trophy. He was 4. None of it was his fault, and I told him so. And he shook his head and said being 4 was an excuse with an expiration date, and he had kept using it until he was 44. Then he told me his side, like laying out evidence. The beer with Larkin, the search results that fit on one page. The public affairs office that thanked him for his interest. The birthday that fell apart without me, and the moment over the store cake when the wiring of the family finally showed itself. He told me about the VFW, the master sergeant, the convoy that turned left instead of right, and our father going out to the garage with my photograph. And then he asked me nothing, which was the gift. He just said, "I know you can't fill it in. I came anyway." So I gave him the one thing I could, the single piece I had checked and rechecked and knew I was allowed to hand over. I told him that in the spring of 2010, when I missed his wedding, people I served with died, and that I spent that week holding a piece of the response in my hands, and that I have never once, in 16 years, been able to put that sentence and a banquet hall in the same room. I watched my brother do the math on every couldn't be bothered our father had laughed into a microphone, and I watched it land. He looked sick. He looked at his hands. "We owed you 20 years of benefit of the doubt," he said, "and gave you none of it." I told him the doubt wasn't the debt. Showing up today was the debt, paid. What he did the following week, I did not ask him to do. And I only know because my mother narrated it to me later in the kind of whisper she saves for tornadoes. Doug drove to the house, stood in the kitchen where every joke was ever told, and handed the torch back. "You taught me the army runs on people nobody claps for," he told our father. "Then you spent 25 years refusing to clap for your own daughter." Dad argued, because first sergeants argue. Ran the old defenses. It was a joke. She could have corrected me. Nobody ever told me anything. And my brother, who is the only person alive holding both kinds of credibility in that kitchen, the combat patch and the badge, stood there and did not give an inch. "She did correct you," Doug said, "every year. By coming home anyway. You just never listened to anything she said without words." My mother says Dad sat down at the kitchen table then, heavily, both hands flat on the wood, and for the first time in anyone's memory, looked old. My father's apology, when it came, arrived the only way a proud first sergeant could carry it, which is sideways, in a cardboard box with the return address written in block letters. Inside, wrapped in a grocery bag, was his 1976 edition of the NCO Leadership Manual. The one he carried for 2 decades, spine held together with 100-mile-an-hour tape, his name in faded ink inside the cover, the single most sacred object in his garage. There was a sticky note on it, pencil. "They don't make a manual for this part," it said. "Dinner's at 5 whenever you want it." Dad. I sat at my desk with that note for a long time. It was not enough, and it was also everything, and both of those things were true at once. The way they always are with fathers. I put the manual on my office shelf next to the commissioning photo I had finally framed for myself, and I did not drive down. Not yet. A down payment is not a settlement. We started with Sunday calls, my mother conducting like a woman diffusing something, and the family learned a new skill, talking around my silence with respect instead of filling it with fiction. The jokes that spring were about the weather and the beans and Doug's golf swing. Nobody performed my career at me. It felt like standing in a room where a radio that had played static for 25 years had finally been turned off. Trust isn't rebuilt with one grand gesture. It's rebuilt at 5 o'clock, one plain dinner at a time, and we hadn't had the dinner yet, but the table was set and everyone knew it. Then the Army, which had started all of this, decided how it would end. In the second week of May, Major General Reese's office called mine. The Defense Superior Service Medal I had been put in for at the close of the program review had been approved, and the presentation would be public, an open ceremony at the end of the month. Unclassified citation, families invited. I need you to understand how rare that sentence is in my world. I have a drawer of things I am not allowed to wear and certificates I am not allowed to hang. My entire professional life has been conducted in rooms my family could not enter, honored in language they would never hear. And now a 2-star was offering me an afternoon. One afternoon where the two halves of my life could stand in the same room with the lights on. You've been a roomer your whole career, Ambrose. Reese said on the phone, amused at his own line the way generals are. Come be a fact for an afternoon. The invitation form had a guest line. I typed my parents' names and deleted them. Typed them again, deleted them again. Typed them a third time and sat there with my finger over the key like a woman over a launch console. And that is exactly how Simone Carver found me when she walked in with the afternoon traffic. She read the screen over my shoulder, and then she pulled up a chair and said the thing only a 20-year friend is licensed to say. Worst case, the seats sit empty, and you're exactly where you've always been, she said. Best case, your father hears a general say out loud what you never could. Send it. So I sent them, paper invitations, formal, engraved, no note inside, because I could not find one sentence that held it all. It was the first classified feeling thing I had ever mailed my family. Here's what I am, redacted down to a time and a place. Come if you're coming. Stanton's remediation closed out that same week, and the timing felt like the Army winking at me. He passed his recertification at the top of the cycle, scored a perfect board, and then did something nobody asked him to do. He submitted a formal request to staff the access desk at my ceremony, his name, his signature, volunteering for the door. Teague endorsed it with one line, and the line is the whole story of those 60 days. He knows what's behind the doors now. I approved it the way I approve things, one signature, no commentary. Some circles you get to close with a pen, and then nothing. 2 weeks of nothing. Weeks of the RSVP cards I had tucked into those envelopes did not come back. Doug, I knew, had a court date sitting on the calendar like a boulder, the kind of testimony you cannot move. My mother has not driven highways since her eyes started going, and would never ask Dad to bring her if Dad wasn't going, and Dad, my mother reported, in the careful voice of an embassy, says nothing at all when the subject comes up. He had stood the manual back up on his garage shelf, she said, after I never acknowledged it, and she was afraid he had read my silence as a door closing. The two of us trading silences our whole lives, fluent in the only language that ever hurt us. The night before the ceremony, I pressed my dress uniform alone in my kitchen, the iron hissing, the eagles on the shoulders catching the streetlight through the window. There's a particular loneliness to preparing for an honor by yourself, and I had gotten so good at it over the years that I almost didn't notice I was doing it again. The way you don't notice an old limp. I laid the ribbons out on the counter in order and checked their alignment with a ruler because my hands needed a task my mind couldn't argue with. Somewhere in a drawer, I still have the program from my commissioning, the one my mother saved, and I took it out that night for the first time in years and looked at the girl in the photograph, and I thought about everything she didn't know. Then I hung the uniform on the closet door and lay in the dark looking at it. I had cleared thousands of people into rooms in my life, decided, named, signed for everyone. I fell asleep not knowing if the 3 people I had finally cleared into mine would walk through the door. The ceremony was the last Friday of May, in a hall on the base with flags down both walls and rows of folding chairs that have hosted 1,000 afternoons like it, except no afternoon is like it when it is yours. I arrived early, because I always arrive early, and the first person I saw was Captain Joel Stanton, squared away at the entrance desk with the roster, and this time he had built the roster himself, walked it through my own office's procedures, checked it 3 times. He saw me and came to attention with a precision that had nothing nervous left in it. "Ma'am," he said, "you're expected." and there was the smallest smile under it, both of us standing in the healed place where the corridor used to be. I have received salutes from generals that meant less. People talk about second chances like they are gifts you hand down, but standing at that desk I understood they are actually loans, and the interest is paid in exactly this. A young officer doing the job right on a morning when it matters, in front of the woman who decided he deserved the chance to. I will not pretend I didn't watch the door. The hall filled, colleagues, program people, Simone in the second row with her jaw set like an honor guard. The seats I had requested sat empty on the aisle, 4 of them, and I stood up front in my dress uniform watching them the way you watch a radio for a voice. 2 minutes before the adjutant called the room, there was a small commotion at the entrance, and my brother came through the door in his courtroom suit, his wife on his arm, moving fast, the way you move when a judge has mercifully continued a case and you have driven 4 hours on the strength of it. Behind him, on his arm, came my mother, in the blue dress she saves for weddings. And behind her, last through the door he had been told he could enter, in a jacket and tie with a tiny brass first sergeant's diamond pinned to his lapel, came Jean Ambrose, 75 years old, jaw set like a man reporting to a promotion board. Nobody had called ahead. They just came. Stanton checked them in himself, and I watched my father shake the young captain's hand without the faintest idea of what he was shaking. The citation, Reese read himself, which is not protocol, which was the point. It was unclassified, every word weighed by 3 offices, and it still said everything, the way good redaction sometimes does. 2 decades of safeguarding the nation's most sensitive capabilities. Judgment exercised at the highest levels of trust in rooms that will never be named. A career, the citation said, conducted entirely out of the light to the immense benefit of those who live in it. And then Reese looked up from the folder, off script, at the rows of chairs. Most of us get to be proud in public, he said. Colonel Ambrose let the country be proud on her behalf, quietly, for 25 years. I'd asked the room to consider what that costs. He let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then the adjutant asked the audience to rise for the presentation, and before the sentence was finished, before the colleagues and the program staff and the second row, one man was already on his feet, rising the way only 30 years of formations can teach a man to rise, shoulders back, heels together, chin level. My father stood first. They fastened the medal, and the room was applauding, and I was fine. I want you to know I was completely fine. Right up until the moment the applause thinned, and I looked out and saw the old first sergeant in the 4th row bring his hand up. Slow and precise. Elbow at the angle the manual on my shelf prescribes. The first salute my father has ever given me in his life. 25 years. One gesture. One. Every dinner, every toast, every windowless joke gathered up and handed back in the only sentence his body knew how to say. I returned it the way you return something priceless, carefully, all the way through, and neither of us performed anything, and that was the point. My mother was crying. Doug was grinning like a kid with a trophy, leaning over to the stranger beside him, and I caught it, the thing he was doing. He was narrating. That's my sister, he was saying. That one. Mine. Afterward, there was a receiving line, because there is always a receiving line, and I stood in it and watched my 2 worlds shake hands with each other. Simone introduced herself to my mother and told her, in the careful, unclassified grammar we all speak at events like that she had been borrowing me for 20 years and intended to keep doing it. Major Teague paid his respects to my father, one professional to another, and I saw Dad straighten under it, the old radar recognizing the real thing when it walked up. And at the end of the line came Captain Stanton, who could have slipped out with the chairs and the programs, and instead planted himself in front of my family and said, "You should know your daughter had my career in her hands this spring," and she handed it back to me better than she found it. My father looked at him for a long moment, first sergeant to captain, 50 years of doorways between them. Then he said, "She learned that somewhere, son, and it wasn't from me. Dinner was at 5, at the house in Fayetteville." Because of course it was. My mother's casserole, the real one, the recipe I had been approximating alone at my counter on Easter. The manual went back to Jean's shelf in the garage, where it belongs, re-gifted, both of us pretending the exchange had been about the book. The family sat around the same table, where the story of me had calcified for 2 decades, and nobody asked what I do, and the silence sat beside us like a guest everyone had finally been introduced to. They know its name now. They don't need its contents. On the porch, when I was leaving, my father stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the yard and said quietly, in the voice he used to save for soldiers who had done something right when nobody was watching, I ran 1,000 formations. I never once got to stand in one for you. I'm sorry it took a general to call it. I told him he heard it the first time it was ever said out loud. So did I. I drove home that night with the windows down and the porch light steady in my mirror until the road bent. And for the first time in my adult life, leaving didn't feel like exile, and staying hadn't felt like surrender. It just felt like a family. Finally fluent in the language I'd been speaking alone for 25 years, the peace I have now isn't loud. Peace never is. It's a Sunday phone call where nobody performs. It's a brother who shows up with his hat in his hand. It's a sticky note in pencil, framed now, on my office shelf, between a leadership manual and a photograph of a 22-year-old who had no idea what she was about to carry, or how long, or how alone. She'd do it all again. I want that on the record. Every windowless room, every silent year, every seat at the edge of the frame. The work was always worth it. The only thing I'd tell her is this, and I'm telling you, whoever you are, wherever your family has filed you, if you're the one they never learned to see, hold your post anyway. Some doors take 25 years to open. Stand where the truth can find you and let it do the talking. It only ever needs a door to open. And one day, if you're lucky, an old soldier rises out of a folding chair before anyone else in the room, and you find out he was watching you the whole time, waiting, the way you were, for somebody to finally read the signature. So that's my story. 25 years of windowless rooms, one laugh at a door, and a salute I waited my whole life for. If you've ever been the one your family never learned to see, the one whose work became the joke at every dinner table, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me, who was your captain at the door? The person who wrote you off with half the information? And did the people who doubted you ever get to hear the truth, said out loud? If this story hit home, hit that like button and subscribe. And remember, you don't have to perform the truth. You just have to stand where it can find you.